Without quite meaning to do so, the federal government had undertaken the work of the Underground Railroad on a scale that would help destroy the plantation economy of the Confederacy. John Brown's dream of a subterranean passway became an open highway wherever federal troops marched. Slaves poured by the thousands and tens of thousands into refugee camps behind Union lines. The war ended the usefulness of the railroad, the Detroit Underground leader William Lambert told an interviewer in 1886, adding that the last fugitive he saw passed through that city in April 1862. The line of freedom crossed the lakes and moved south, keeping step by step with the battle line of the Union. On January 1, 1863, Lincoln signed the Emancipation Proclamation, which freed slaves in all areas still in rebellion and not yet in Union hands. However, it didn't apply in slave states, such as Maryland and Kentucky, that had not seceded. The proclamation was an open invitation to slaves to flee. What had once been treason was now government policy. That May, the Union began arming black troops. As the lines of the Underground Railroad fell into disuse, its agents, conductors, and station masters offered themselves to the war effort. 5 of John Rankin's sons and a grandson, all of them Underground veterans, would serve in the Union forces. Frederick Douglass, Jermaine Logan, and Mary Ann Shadd Carey, she had married a black Canadian businessman, worked vigorously throughout the war to recruit black volunteers for the Union cause. Harriet Tubman, serving as a spy in Union-occupied South Carolina, would become the first woman in American history to lead a detachment of troops in battle. Josiah Henson's son, Tom, who had taught him to read his first words, joined the Union Navy and was never heard from again. Joseph Hayden, who as a child had ridden out of slavery in Kentucky beneath the seat of the carriage driven by Calvin Fairbank, also saw service in the Navy on the Gulf Coast and would die there in 1865. William Still resigned his job with the Philadelphia Anti-Slavery Office and formed a company to supply coal to the Union Army. Garrett Smith, who recovered rapidly from his breakdown once the threat of prosecution was passed, donated between $20,000 and $25,000, between $400,000 and $500,000 in present-day terms, to the U.S. Sanitary Commission and the Christian Commission to provide soldiers with medical care and Bibles on the front lines. Levi Coffin and many other Quakers worked heroically to improve living conditions in the often appallingly unsanitary refugee camps where so many contrabands lived out the war. By 1863, the Western battlefront had moved deep into Tennessee and Mississippi. But Kentucky remained an anomaly. Since it had never seceded from the Union, the federal government was scrupulous in respecting its laws, including those upholding slavery. Indeed, poor Calvin Fairbank, who had been arrested for abducting the slave Tamar in 1851, was still in the state penitentiary 13 years later, having endured during that time more than 1,000 beatings and a total of 35,105 stripes from a leather strap. He maintained a record. He was not released until 1864 by special order of the governor. Bypassed by the war, Arnold Gragston continued his clandestine trips across the Ohio River. Although his nocturnal activities took an obvious toll on his daytime work, his master never asked him what he had been doing. Gragston suspected, in fact, that he might actually be some kind of secret abolitionist himself. Sometimes, he speculated, I think he did know and wanted me to get the slaves away that way so he wouldn't have to cause hard feelings by freeing them. Although Gragston never kept count, he guessed that he carried hundreds of fugitives across the river during the 4 years that he served the Underground. However, one night in 1863, after rowing a cargo of fugitives to Ohio, he was spotted as he stepped back onto the Kentucky shore, and fearing that he was finally about to be caught, took to a fugitive's life in the fields and woods. Gragston was his own last passenger. Finally, I saw that I could never do any more good in Mason County, so I decided to take my freedom, too, Gragston recalled. I had a wife by this time, and one night we quietly slipped across and headed for Mr. Rankin's Bell and Light. It looked like we had to go almost to China to get across the river. I could hear the bell and see the light on Mr. Rankin's place, but the harder I rode, the farther away it got, and I knew if I didn't make it, I'd get killed. But finally I pulled up by the lighthouse and went on to my freedom. It is possible that his journey north was the last triumphant escape on the Underground Railroad. There was, of course, no official termination to the Underground Railroad. But if ever it had a symbolic end, it can be said to have come in April 1870, when blacks throughout the United States celebrated the passage of the 15th Amendment, which extended suffrage to African Americans. At a huge interracial rally in Cincinnati, 73-year-old Levi Coffin publicly relinquished the title of president of the Underground Railroad that had been conferred on him 30 years earlier by Southern slave hunters. "Our underground work is done," he declared, "and as we have no more use for the road, I would suggest that the rails be taken up and disposed of, and the proceeds appropriated for the education of the freed slaves." On the same day in Detroit, George the Baptist placed a sign in his store window that read, "Notice to stockholders of the Underground Railroad. This office is closed. Hereafter all stockholders will receive dividends according to their merits."